Chapter 7, Behavior Theory, presented by Lindsay Career, Antonio Simpson, Jessica Hill, and Amanda Arsenault. What is behavior theory? Behavior theory consists of ideas about how human actions and emotions are developed, are sustained, and are extinguished through principles of learning. The overall goal of behavior theory is to change behavior. This being said, behavior theory is not concerned with internal mental processes and how this could have an impact. When I say internal mental processes, I mean that they are not necessarily concerned with what is happening in their brain or what may have happened in the past that's affecting their current behaviors, but they're more concerned about behavior that is based on what the person physically does, thinks, or feels that can be observed at the moment so that they can know how to move forward with treatment. They also do this by going through the scientific method, what we all know as asking a question, doing background research, constructing a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis by doing an experiment, analyzing your data, drawing a conclusion, and then communicating your results. Some argue that behavior theory is not even necessarily considered a theory. They say this because behavior theory focuses on empirical evidence and does not require abstract thinking as explanations for thoughts, feelings, or behavior. Because they're so focused on empirical evidence, that is why many people argue that it's not necessarily considered a theory. So there are three major approaches to behavior theory. The first one being behavior analysis, which focuses on the consequences of behavior. The second is stimulus response, which focuses on the environmental factors that elicit and maintain behavior. And the third one is social learning theory, which focuses on cognitive meditational processes. Considering how behavior theory came about, it became prominent in the social sciences since the first half of the 20th century and became popular among clinical practitioners by the 1960s. Behavior theory is linked with an advance in empiricism, which is basically knowledge based on observation or sensory experience. Behavior theory also insists that all claims should withstand testing and verification. Moving into important individuals in the progression of behavior theory, we'll start with William Wundt. He was the first major innovator in behaviorism in psychology. He was named the father of experimental psychology and believed that laws of cognitive and emotional experience could be derived with the same research methods that were being used to study human physiology at the time. Even Pavlov created classical conditioning, which is learned responses as we know it. Edward Thorndike invented the puzzle box to study rats and developing principles of apparent conditioning. Apparent conditioning is where behavior is sensitive to or controlled by its consequences. John Watson coined the term behaviorism and brought it to mainstream psychology. His main focus was on observable facts rather than consciousness. He believed that consciousness was private, but observable facts provided enough data for scientific activity. B.F. Skinner disagreed with Watson and believed that behaviorists should focus at the level of the person. He also refined the principles of apparent conditioning and brought this theory into public consciousness. Watson and Skinner were what they call radical behaviorists because they recognized the existence of mental processes but were not concerned with them. Unlike Tolman and Hall, who were moderate behaviorists, this meant that they were interested in the existence of mental processes. Though both of them recognized them, only the moderate behaviorists actually were interested in them. Albert Bandura is responsible for what we call modeling, which is when people learn not only by direct reinforcement, but also by seeing how behaviors of others is reinforced. Joseph Wolf applied research from animal laboratories to actual human processes with neurotic disorders. They had been doing research for a while on animals, but this was the first time that someone had actually brought them over to use this research with humans. Edwin Thomas was the first social worker to advocate for behavior perspectives in direct practice. and Mark Mattini brought up the eco-behavioral model, which encourages social workers to assess human behaviors in a broader context than others may consider. Considering some basic principles and assumptions of behavior theory as stressed in Chapter 7 of the reading, it is important to recognize that behavior is based on what a person does, thinks, or feels that can be observed. Behavior theory should focus on observable events. We keep stressing that because that's the basis of behavior theory. It focuses on observable events with a minimum of interpretation. This means that they want the facts to be clearly laid out right in front of them without having to interpret what could have happened to possibly have an effect on what's happening with their current behavior. Behavior therapy stresses that people are motivated by nature to seek pleasure and avoid pain, and this is evidenced by their behaviors and actions that seek to bring them to a positive outcome rather than bring them somewhere that could hurt them in the end. Behavior theory also states that people behave based on learning, direct environmental feedback, and by watching others behave and interact. This is important to remember as a practitioner, that people's behaviors can change based on how they learn, what type of feedback we give them, and by increasing the opportunity for them to watch others and gain positive behaviors from that. Another thing that's very important to remember is that behavior can easily change. It is not something that is set in stone, although a lot of people believe so. If someone has the determination and willingness to understand and recognize their behaviors, it is possible, very possible, for them to change. And this is why behavior theory is focused on understanding behaviors to encourage a positive change, because they truly believe that their behaviors do have the ability to be changed. Behavior theory also states that intervention should focus on influencing reinforcements or punishments for clients' behaviors, which is used as a technique to change behavior. It's kind of like when parents use reinforcements or punishments to show their child what they would believe is right or wrong. It's kind of the same kind of technique used with clients from their therapists. Behavior theory also suggests that thoughts and feelings are behaviors subject to reinforcement behaviors, and that when practicing behavior theory, it is important to use simple explanations for behavior in practice so that the client can truly understand what you're trying to get across to them.
In slide 10, I will be going over the major approaches to behavior therapy. My first definition I will give is behavior analysis, which focuses on the consequences of the behavior. The practitioner uses direct assignments, research evidence, and single subject experiment designs to inform and evaluate intervention. The main aim of the practice is to increase behaviors such as social skills and decrease behaviors such as drug abuse. As you can see on your right, the first picture is the Willy Wonka gentleman who rewarded kids, or I guess the movie raffle, candy bars, and they was not supposed to eat the candy bars. And the result in the candy bars, the kids lost their opportunity to go through the chocolate factory if they ate the candy without his consent, which brings me to the stimulus response, otherwise known as a cause and effect. The kids ate the candy. Because they ate the candy, they got booted out of the chocolate factory. Can be regarded as the foundation of behavior. It is the foundation stone on which we build our behavior model. For example, stimulus consists is a driver cut you off while you're driving down the road. The drivers respond, they're frightened, but they shrugged it off and continued the trip. So they didn't allow being afraid stop them, but they did affect them because they were afraid, but they continued despite of being afraid. Social learning theory. Social learning theory is a view that people learn by observing others. On the bottom, I have a psychologist by the name of Albert Bandura. He worked in the 1960s. His theory was the social learning theory explains how people learn new behaviors, values, and attitudes. I'll give you an example. An example is a child might see their sibling receiving a lollipop for behaving politely. Some of us who have kids understand that. But some of us who have two kids or cousins or nieces or sisters or brothers, because they behave, they got a candy bar or they got a lollipop in this situation. Well, that tends to make the other kid behave because they observe that kid behaving to get the lollipop, so they tend to do likewise. In slide 11, I will be going over the three principles of learning. First will be the classical conditioning. The second will be operative conditioning. Third will be modeling conditioning. And the first definition of classical conditioning, it is developing a pattern of behavior through response to environmental stimulus or specific behavioral consequences. For example, student takes a math test 3 times. The student is very unsuccessful 3 times taking the math test. In return, the student will feel that that test was just not okay, it was not good. That's a classical condition where the result is the student not successfully passing the test despite of taking it 3 times. The operative conditioning definition is a future behavior determined by the consequence of present behavior. An example of a positive reinforcement is having a job and going to that job every day, and at the end of the week, you receive a paycheck for working that job every day. Example of negative reinforcement is when a teacher exempts a student from a final exam for perfect attendance. Due to because the teacher exempt the student from the exam for perfect attendance, that professor or teacher is taking the exam away. That something is unpleasant for the student who have a perfect attendance. Modeling condition. It is a learned behavior by watching others engage with one another. This includes reinforcement and punishment. An example of this is when a young child see another child petting a dog. That first young child is afraid, but once they see that second young child pet the dog, that first child becomes not afraid and will in return go to the dog and try to pet it as well. Because they have learned and observed the second child do it successfully, that child will intend thinks that it's okay to do. Slide 12 is observation questioning. As social workers, we have a lot of observation questioning. We tend to draw conclusions before that we actually engage with someone. But the famous things we tend to ask is where, is actually when, where, who, how, and what. During that time, a therapist or social worker will say when something happened, where did it happen, how did it happen, who was involved, what took place. Here we have a therapist on your right with a client, probably asking those questions that I just brought up. The picture you have on your left top is questions that we tend to have in our head, and we usually have a lot of questions, so we tend to think a lot. Slide 13, which is the last slide, is the 5 domains of behavior analysis. On the right, you have antecedents, triggers, and things that and cures that you tend to have, and then you have the domain when you have the five domain questions or words are environmental, social, physical, emotional, and cognitive. And then on my left, on my right rather, I have consequence and reinforce. Some of the questions that you may want to ask or ask in antecedents is what people, place, and things act as cures for a problem. What is the level of client day-to-day exposure to the cures, and can some of the cures be easily avoided? Environmental is the consequences of that is what people, place, things have been affected by the problem as the client environment changed as a result of the problem. The second domain where it would be social. And the antecedent, the question would be, with whom does the client spend most of their time with? Second question would be in the same antecedent is, does the client have relationships with people who do have the problem? Does the client live with someone who is involved in the problem? The consequence, has the client's social network changed since the problem began or escalated? And how have his relationship or her been affected? Next domain word would be physical. The question would state, what uncomfortable physical state precedes the problem occurrence? The consequence is, how does the client feel physically afterwards? And how is he or she or her or him physically health as a result of that? Next word would be emotional. Question you ask and see is, what feeling states precedes the occurrence of the problem? The consequence, how does the client feel afterwards? What does the client feel about him or herself? Last, cognitive domain. Antecedent, triggers or cures. What thoughts run through the client's mind, or what belief does the client have about the problem? Consequence, is he or she thinking afterwards? How does he or she feel about himself?
Next, we're going to talk about the intervention steps of behavior theory. These steps are very structured and specific and systematic. There are 10 steps in all, and the first one is when the client and therapist meet together to discuss the client's problems, behavior problems, that they would like to change and address. And the client discusses the problems with the therapist and chooses the ones that they would like to make changes on. The second step is to create and develop measurable outcomes for these behaviors. The client and therapist collaborate together to develop measurable goals and outcomes for this client so that the client can change their behavior to a more desirable outcome. The third step is when the practitioner and the client work together to gather the baseline data, which basically means the client's behavior that is not desired before the intervention is implemented. And they also work together to develop steps required to reach the resolution of the problem, and that is the fourth step. The fifth step is
that the client resources are identified. These could be people who reinforce the desired behavior of the client. It could be family members or friends or other people who are there for the client to help them through to get to their desired behavior. And it can also be the therapy sessions where the client is reminded of their goals and discusses these barriers that they are having. And also potential obstacles and barriers are identified, and that would be step 6. These are obstacles that would prevent the client from obtaining the desired behavior that is healthy for them. And it also prevents them from achieving the goals that they have set. The 7th step is for clients to create an intervention strategy, and this is collaboratively done with the practitioner. And this is a time for them to choose something that is best for the client and what will work specifically for them. And it is the basic rule of the behavior theory process with this client. And this will focus on rewarding the positive behavior of the client rather than punishing the negative behavior. So it focuses on the positive. Now moving on to step 8. This is where the practitioner and the client or other persons involved in this process for the client collect data about the positive things that the client is doing, their activities, whether they're relapsing back to the negative behavior that they want to rid themselves of, or whether they're achieving their goals and participating in positive behaviors. And all of this, through this process, all of this behavior change is documented on a regular basis so that accurate evaluations may be done. The 9th step is when the intervention process is evaluated. And this is important because it determines whether this process was successful or not for this particular client. And it is where the client and practitioner collaborate once again. This whole process is very collaborative between the practitioner and the client. And they regularly evaluate this process. So this isn't a one-time thing. It's when the practitioner and client are constantly evaluating as they go, and they compare the baseline conditions, so the client's bad behavior or undesired behavior that they think of as negative in their life, to the current, more changed positive behavior, and determine how often they are participating in this changed behavior, when they are doing it, where they're doing it, and the different factors that make them change. And finally, the 10th step is when the intervention ends. And this is a fading process. It doesn't abruptly end. The client is slowly removing the negative behavior and adding the positive behavior changes. And as this process happens, the support systems that they have, the reinforcers in their lives, and the sessions with the practitioner slowly fade. And this is shown to be most effective, so that the client isn't just left cut and dry, but that they slowly work into independence in demonstrating these positive behaviors. And this process is called fading. Next, we will talk about an alternative behavior theory, and this is called applied behavior analysis. This is what social workers typically use specifically on children who have autism spectrum disorders. And this is a more intense theory and form of behavior theory. And it focuses on basic skills training. It breaks down the concept of behavior theory and makes it more understandable for these children with these disorders. And it begins with examining what elements of the child's problem behavior are negative and what they would like to remove and what would be healthy for them to remove. And also focuses on what the consequences are of having those negative elements of behavior. And then these different elements are removed from the child, and the desirable behaviors are broken down into parts so that the child can have an opportunity to sit down with a therapist and they can describe to the child what these different elements, desirable elements, are and how they can achieve them. Positive reinforcement is very important for these children over negative. Positive reinforcement helps the child feel successful and want to keep going and achieve these goals. This intervention is also very lengthy and intense. It takes a while for these children to, at times, be able to grasp this concept and develop these positive behaviors. These interventions are one-on-one with a therapist or sometimes in small groups, and they teach the behavioral and educational interventions that will reinforce the positive behavior. These can be from at least 10 to 15 hours per week, these sessions, and they can be for a very long time, ranging from months to even years at times. It depends on the child, where their cognitive levels are at, and how severe their problem behaviors are, and how willing they are and able they are to have reinforcements to help them develop these positive behaviors. And this has proven to help clients adaptive, cognitive, and language skills, as well as to reduce, of course, the problem behavior. Next, we are going to describe the element of spirituality within the behavior theory. The behavior theory does not discuss any sort of spirituality or purpose in life. Behavior theory practitioners that use this theory do not really delve into spirituality or talk about purpose in life, because those things are very abstract and they're internal. They're things that cannot be seen and observed most of the time. And these therapists typically only use spirituality or discuss someone's purpose in life or what their religious beliefs are only if they're related to a goal that someone has, such as wanting to get closer to God if they're a Christian, or wanting to develop their behavior in relation to something to do with their religion. They also may talk about spirituality with a client if it has to do with a behavior such as the number of church services they go to, something that's related to the problem behaviors that they're working with the client on. Since there really is no spiritual application in behavior theory, I decided to develop an example of how behavior theory relates to spirituality. And this is that having a purpose in life affects our behavior because as a Christian, for example, we're living for the purpose of God, and that affects our behavior. We want to obey God's commands and regulations and His Word. So that directly affects our behavior, even though you can't see our faith. Also, behavior theory is very straightforward and very cut and dry. These behaviors are good and these behaviors are bad. And that's how Christianity is as well in most religions. They have a set of behaviors that are sins or not good, and a set of behaviors that are good and that get us to our spiritual goal. So that is just a little way to apply spirituality to maybe understand the behavior theory a little bit deeper.
How do we know behavior theory works? Well, there are many reasons, and I will start with behavior theory is backed by quantitative research methods. This means numbers and percentages, not based upon a feeling. Behavioral treatments have been established for treating panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, social anxiety, major depression, anorexia, sexual dysfunction related to anxiety, and many others. Two meta-analyses have established medication combined with behavioral interventions are most effective for ADHD in children. Also, behavioral methods to treat obsessive-compulsive disorder in children and adolescents are as effective as medication. Also, several reviews and studies have concluded behavioral therapy-based interventions work and are often used with children who show problem behaviors. For example, 12 parenting skills development programs were shown to have positive effects on antisocial behavior short-term, but unclear for long-term effects. 32 treatment programs in Europe found behavioral and cognitive behavioral programs to reduce repeat offenses by juveniles and adults by 12%. A review of 11 studies concluded media-based interventions such as self-instructional manuals and DVDs were also effective for parents to use with children with problem behaviors. A review of 51 studies on the treatment of insomnia concluded behavioral treatments such as relaxation strategies improved sleep. A review of 30 studies of behavioral marital therapy concluded improvement in relations through communication, problem solving, emotion expressiveness skills, and other techniques. A review of 30 studies showed that giving substance abusers money-based incentives when a therapeutic goal was completed was effective. And finally, a review of 194 studies on HIV prevention interventions showed effectiveness with more active interventions such as role plays, learning to apply condoms, regularly taking HIV tests, and sexual self-management strategies. Applied behavior analysis is a form of a behavioral intervention. For social workers and other professionals who work with autism spectrum disorders in children, this is a standard intervention. A main focus is on basic skills training. The steps are to first make an examination of past problem behaviors and consequences. Then remove precursors for problem behaviors, and the desirable behaviors are broken down and explained to the children. And lastly, positive reinforcements are provided. Applied behavior analysis has made improvements in clients' adaptive, cognitive, and language skills, as well as problem behaviors. When discussing behavior theory and social justice, behavioral practitioners can determine, according to Walsh, what reinforcers social workers and their clients possess that can be utilized to manipulate other individuals who distribute reinforcers like housing, medical care, and social services. Social workers have knowledge and resources that are known as collective reinforcers. Numerous behavioral interventions with individuals and small groups have targeted social justice issues such as household energy consumption, trash control, and racial integration. Behavioral interventions are available for numerous social problems, including school violence, substance abuse, unemployment, chronic medical illnesses, hospice care, and many other problems. When behavioral practices and interventions are effective, client skills are increased in being able to positively influence their environment. Empowering clients to increase their skills includes enhancing advocacy skills and their interpersonal skills. Behaviorism requires social workers to become familiar with culturally diverse groups so they can understand each person's unique set of reinforcers. A case example given by Walsh is titled Mama's Boy. This example demonstrates how children and adults act toward each other with hostility resulting in an undesired effect. This is going to show an operant behavioral intervention that will teach the parent to use reinforcement to break the child's negative behavior and frustrating patterns. This is done by ignoring or punishing negative behaviors. This intervention is available to individuals, families, or groups. To have success in parenting skills, 5 steps are recognized. These steps are 1. Priority goal is selected. 2. The goals are separated into tasks. 3. Tasks are used to encourage positive behavior. 4. A baseline or occurrence of the behavior is determined using numbers. And 5. The priority goal is established. Reinforcement systems are put into place to assist with achieving positive behaviors. Some are shaping, which is reinforcing positive behavior to meet the goal. Another is high probability behavior, such as watching TV and playing outside. Social reinforcements like praise, hugs, and a smile. Token economies, such as chips, tickets, and stickers that are awarded for desirable behaviors and traded for agreed upon rewards. Punishment, such as harsh words or removal of positive events to decrease undesirable responses. Extinction, which is no longer reinforcing a behavior, resulting in the decrease of the behavior. A timeout or isolation, which is punishment that involves removing a child from the source for a brief period of time to remove the negative behavior. Lastly, distraction, paired with ignoring negative behavior, has been effective in young children. Social skills development is another behavioral intervention with children and adolescents. This is a process of teaching clients how to engage in socially appropriate behavior. An assumption is the client is capable of improved social behavior, but does not practice this behavior due to lack of reinforcement behaviors or learning. There are 9 steps in the social skills development, which include a thorough assessment to determine the skill that is needed or wanted, describe the skill, Outline all parts of the skill. Model the skill for the client. Role play each part of the skill. Evaluate the role play. Do a full rehearsal of the skill. Encourage the client to use the skill in real-life scenarios. And finally, evaluate and refine the skill. The Smart Shopper example uses strategies related to classical conditioning, which was explained earlier in the chapter. This example is where an older adult who has lost his wife and is now afraid to leave the house. This scenario uses systemic desensitization, which is confronting anxieties through a series of steps from easy to the most difficult. Systematic desensitization is a type of exposure therapy, and flooding, which is when a client is overwhelmed with fear of an object or situation so the client can learn to tolerate it. This older male has developed a panic disorder when it comes to leaving his home and chose to isolate himself. Through a process of classical conditioning, the older male had developed this fear. He was taught a relaxation technique by a social worker and rehearsed it, which included sitting with his eyes closed. Breathe through his nose. Gradually inhale and concentrate on the lungs filling up with air. Hold the breath for a couple seconds. Exhale the breath slowly while relaxing the abdomen. And repeat these steps up to 5 times. The client was able to identify a reward to build operant reinforcement, and the results are usually quick, happening in 3 to 4 sessions. This concludes Chapter 7, Behavior Theory, from Theories for Direct Social Work Practice by Joseph Walsh.